Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another Goblin Lore podcast. This episode is going to be the first of two in a series where we talk to Morgan Wentworth and Bibliivore Orc about books in Magic the Gathering. This is another classic interview podcast for us where we had so much great information from our guests, so many great stories and things to think about that we just couldn't fit it all into one podcast. So we decided that we're going to give you another 2 podcast episode so that you can spread out the discussion without getting the daunting time of an hour-long episode on your plate. You'll note that there's a little bit of thumping and clicking going on during this podcast. That's actually due to Hobbs's dog Watson, who is sitting in the dining room with us as we recorded. You'll have to forgive us for his collar clinking. Thanks, quality control, Watson. Finally, you'll also notice a little bit of echo coming from our microphones. That's because we were recording in a wooden space. We didn't realize the acoustics until after we'd recorded the episode. So next time that we do a larger group live session, we'll have that figured out. With all that out of the way, let's get to the show. Hello, Podwalkers, and welcome to another episode of Goblin Lore. This week is a super special episode. We are recording from GP Minneapolis. Well, from Minneapolis, not at the GP. We're at Hobbs's house. But it is GP weekend, and even more special than that, we have 2 guests on today, Morgan Wentworth and Bibliivore Orc, to come talk about books in Magic and why books are important to Magic lore, how they contribute to Magic art, and we're going to have our first ever Duel of the Librarians. But first, I would like to introduce my lovely co-hosts, or have them introduce themselves, and then tell us also where listeners can find you on Twitter and a piece of Magic flavor text that you identify with. Why don't we start with you, Morgan?
My name is Morgan, and you can find me on Twitter at MTGValkyrie. I post about the Magic stuff that I'm doing, about book cards that I found, and about the races that I'm running right now. And flavor text that I really identify with is from the Eternal Masters edition of Enlightened Tutor. It says, "Organization is often undervalued, but rarely unjustified." Quoting Frasio, Royal Archivist.
I am Orcish Librarian. You can find me on Twitter at Bibliivore Orc. And I'm not sure that you wanted to phrase it by inviting us to dig in to books and lore, because I'm liable to take that instruction a little bit literally. But hopefully I can refrain from eating anything that I'm not supposed to eat here today. Flavor text that speaks to me, I'm going to go with the text on Baron Master Wizard from Urza's Saga, who is depicted on the card holding a book, so we're being on theme here. And he is quoted as saying, "Knowledge is no more expensive than ignorance, and at least as satisfying."
All right, I'm Alex. We found on Twitter at AlexanderNewM. And I think my favorite flavor text is from an unhinged card called Doubleheader. Players that don't read flavor text aren't too bright, sort of smell, and dress funny. But let's just keep that between us, okay? They can get kind of violent.
I'm Hobbs. You can find me at HobbsQ. Mine, I feels like it could be on an uncard, but it's not. It's the flavor text from Mana Barbs that is, I don't know why people say a double-edged sword is bad. It's a sword with 2 edges. Kamal Pitfighter.
You get twice as much sword.
That's
value.
Right, that's just value. I love it.
Can't leave that value on the table.
And I'm your host, Joe Redeman. You can find me on Twitter at Fyndhorn. That's Fynd Horn. And I'm going to pick my favorite commander card here. That's Scrambleverse. And Scrambleverse's flavor text is, "Sometimes a little chaos is in order." And you know me, love puns. Love my puns. So, with that out of the way...
Well, we made it 5 minutes.
That's pretty good. That's actually a record for us.
I think it is.
Yeah. Puns contribute to our literary theme today. You know? Hey, it's a good transition. Okay, that was better than usual.
If we're not supposed to do puns, you needed to warn me about that beforehand, because that's like 20% of what I say.
Well, that's why we brought you on. It's just directly on brand.
Oh, thank God. Okay.
We're gonna talk about books today. We're gonna talk about literature in Magic, not only in the game itself, but also in the world of Magic. So talking about books in world, and why don't we start with the cards, though? I mean, that's where most of us, at least, start with the cards and start with seeing it as a tangible thing. So what function does a book serve in the game?
The thing about the significance of books in Magic is it actually starts with the rules of the game. Your deck is defined as your library. And so books directly translate to a body of knowledge that you have access to in your library.
That's very right. I mean, that's there's a reason it's called a library. I mean, it was this idea that you basically were pulling spells out of your collection. I mean, that you had the knowledge to bring these things forth, and you kept them collected somewhere. And I love the idea of mill in that way, and the idea that you lose the game, basically, if you deplete your library, which is kind of a cool thing. Which is why everybody should play 200-card decks.
Well, and you see this idea reflected even in the design of the card back, which is, you know, the one and only thing about the game really that's remained constant from 1993 forward is the design of that card back. It's meant to evoke the idea that you're looking at a spell book. It has that kind of quality to it, and I think that really sets the tone for this idea that it's a representation almost in physical form, like Morgan said. It's not your deck, it's your library, and these are the spells that you have access to because they're contained in this book.
And to continue that too, the original packaging of the game, like I started it revised, and even there, the starter decks had the picture of the back on the front because it's a tome, but the sides had pages and a binding.
Oh.
So the
So cool.
deck box looked like a book.
It's sick. I don't know if I remember that. I do know it's interesting too that we talk about the library being knowledge, but you have long-term knowledge in your deck, in your library. This is all the stuff that you have access to. Basically, you can go to your bookshelf and pull this off, out of your library. But you also have your hand, which functions as knowledge too. How does that relate to the library, or to that flavor of the books that you have in your collection, as it were?
I think that goes to Alpha with Library of Lang.
Yeah. Library of Lang is such a cool card for those of you who are not aware. The Library of Lang says, skip your discard step. If an effect causes you to discard a card, discard it, but you may put it on top of your library instead of your graveyard. The representation of your hand is knowledge you have immediate access to, kind of similar to how spells work in Dungeons & Dragons, where in order to cast a spell, you burn a spell slot. So you burn that spell, you either put it into play or put it into your discard pile once you cast it. And the Library of Lang functions as a way to prevent you from burning that spell without casting it.
And it's kind of a theme that we see on. There's not a ton of library cards in the game, but there's a couple. And whether it's Library of Alexandria or Sylvan Library or Library of Latnam, they all kind of share that theme with Library of Lang, which is they give you access to more cards. They give you the opportunity to know more than you would know otherwise, or as it translates into the game mechanics, to cast more spells than you would be able to cast otherwise.
Not to dwell too long on a single card, but I love the flavor of Library of Lang, where someone might make you forget it right now, but because you have this library, you can go back and reclaim that knowledge.
I mean, what's interesting is that, even when they chose to give us the one set where we kind of had a real world Arabian Nights, we kind of had this real world setting. We end up with, they chose to do Library of Alexandria as a card, like represent that within Magic, because that's one of the wonders of the world. And in Magic, when they were still doing weird stuff like having flavor text by Einstein, they let us have this library that, like you said, lets you draw more cards. But you have to have exactly 7 in your hand, which just makes it so fascinating.
Well, and then there's another card which I wanted to talk about actually, which is almost the direct opposite of Library of Alexandria, which is a card in Tempest called Fool's Tome, which is an artifact that lets you draw a card, but only if you have no cards in your hand. as opposed to Library of Alexandria, which lets you draw a card, but only if you already have 7 cards in your hand. And I specifically want to, since we're talking about flavor text, I specifically want to talk about the flavor text on Fool's Tome, which is a sort of transcribed dialogue between Squee and Urte, where Squee says, "What's that?" And Urte says, "It's a magical book." And Squee says, "Am I smart enough to use it?" And Urte says, "You could say that."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great way to pivot to the next part of how we see books in Magic is artifacts, right? So we have, lands like Library of Alexandria, enchantments like Sylvan Library, or some of the draw spells like Library of Latnam. But you have artifacts like the tomes, the JMD tome, Jalem tome, MSE tome, Thrawn tome, all of these. And again, though, these draw you cards in different ways. You have these draw abilities. Again, it's taking this item, this artifact that you find somewhere, and opening it up, cracking it open, and consuming some of that knowledge. No pun intended, Orc.
Too late.
Damn it.
You can't open that door and not expect me to walk through it.
You have these. You have scrolls, and I don't know if you guys is there a flavor difference between how scrolls and tomes function in the game?
Yeah, there is. Because I started really getting into drafting around Avacyn or Stored, there are 2 scrolls that really stand out to me. And they are Scroll of Avacyn and Scroll of Gristlebrand. And the thing about scrolls is they tend to be more single use. Both of those cards require you to pay a mana and sacrifice it in order to get the effect, versus books where they stick around and they're mono artifacts where you can tap it and use it every turn. Additionally, scrolls tend to have more spell-like effects. For example, Spell of the Masters from Fate Reforged, I believe, has an ability where you tap it to give a creature +1/+1 for every non-creature spell you've played. So that one, instead of drawing you cards, cares about the spells that you've played, the knowledge that you have, but instead of using that knowledge to put more cards in your hand to gain you more knowledge from that, you are using that knowledge to make your creature bigger.
One thing is really interesting is the scroll that came to mind for me actually was not actually a scroll, it's a scroll rack. So I love the idea that you kind of are taking the knowledge that you already have and you're putting it back up on the shelf. Like you're swapping out because you need something else right then. And it's just such a cool effect that in the game even. I mean, and I also like it's really interesting because I was just looking at the wording on it. You don't actually draw the cards, so you're actually just literally just swapping them out. I mean, you're not drawing them. They're just, you are grabbing them off your shelf and you have them.
And to go into what Morgan was saying about the difference between scrolls and books, that fits a lot with like Dungeons & Dragons, how they function there. The wizard has a spell book that they use every day to memorize their spells, and that's a permanent item as opposed to a scroll, which is a one-shot use.
And the game of Magic was completely taken from D&D originally, So in a way, I mean, we are kind of chronicling D&D adventures into this almost book-like thing,
We're writing our own stories, you guys.
Well, and I think, too, what's interesting is, like Morgan was saying, that books, when they appear in the game, tend to be, that kind of like mono artifact that has some sort of effect that you can use repeatedly to draw more cards. When you see sort of in the game occasionally the representations of something which prey on books or attack books or destroy books, that's represented by the loss of cards. So you have, not to self-promote here, but you have my namesake critter in there who goes through and chews some cards off of the top of the library because he's not a very good librarian. You have insidious bookworms, which makes the other player discard at random. You have book burning, which takes cards off of the player's library and puts them in the graveyard. You even have like Curse of the Bloody Tome, which has that repeated mill effect. So in the same way that we tend to see books as an opportunity to access more cards, if something goes after books or attacks books or preys on books somehow, that tends to be expressed in the game as the loss of cards.
So that's not always a bad thing, speaking from a librarian's perspective. In order to run a library, you don't have infinite space, so you have to curate the books that you have. And one of the really cool representations of this, although it's a representation that kind of depicts it as negative, from M19 is Dismissive Pyromancer, which is a 2/2 for 2, and it has the ability red tap, discard a card, draw a card. So you are curating your hand in that case. And there are other examples of curating your hand in red that are flavored like red, where it's very random and chaotic, like Burning Inquiry, which is a star of Modern right now. Removing cards from your hand after gaining a lot more knowledge. But I really like the flavor text of the Pyromancer because it's something like toss, keep, toss.
Yeah, he's like thumbing through these different books in the arts, and it's burn,
Yeah,
keep,
yeah.
burn.
Yeah.
Like he's literally just tossing, like he's thumbing through the books with one hand and tossing them into the flames in the background with the other. It's beautiful, yeah.
Or in that same line, I'll go back to Browse, which is a blue enchantment from Alliances, which I have spent more time playing than I probably ought to admit on the air, but it lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library and put 1 into your hand and remove the remaining 4 from the game. So like Morgan was saying, again, it's that idea of like selection. And it even has some Jaya Ballard flavored text where she says, once great literature, now great litter.
Yeah. And it's just so interesting to see that effect on blue. And to see I always get thrown off by seeing these giant flavor text on a blue card.
Well, you could also say too that our namesake card is that same thing.
Well,
Goblin lore.
yeah.
I mean, it's just you don't really get to curate it because it's all random.
Yeah.
And that's very on flavor for the goblins.
Yeah.
That's a Goblin version of curation.
Right.
Just get stuff and then throw away however much we can't carry, and
Right.
whatever's left must be the important stuff because that's what's left.
That's what's right. Also,
We've kind of figured out now a little bit more about how books and scrolls and all this literature functions game-wise. Let's take one step back now into, it's still a part of the card, but let's maybe move a little into more of the flavor. So we've mentioned some of the flavor text, but what does flavor text add for a card? Or you have your whole flavor added thing that you do on Twitter. Can you explain a little bit about that and why? What about adding flavor text to a card that doesn't have it is important to you?
Oh, sure. So flavor added is a thing I do. Hashtag flavor added is a thing I do on Twitter, which a lot of other people do now too, which I love, and I certainly invite people after the show to take a look at it. Hashtag flavor added. And if it's something that you find interesting, it's not like this is a licensed activity. Anybody can do it. And really what it is just looking through Scryfall, looking through Gatherer, or whatever your search engine of choice is for this sort of thing, and finding cards that don't already have flavor text on them, and just using it as kind of a world-building exercise and a creative writing exercise to try to sit down and think, well, if we were going to put flavor text on that card, what might it be like? And the thing I like so much about flavor text is that, I mean, the name is very accurate. What it is it's giving a little extra something to the card. It kind of situates it in this fantasy world. It kind of situates it in this alternate reality with these characters and these storylines, and it can bring emotion into the card. It can bring context into the card. It can bring narrative significance into the card. It can bring humor into the card. It's really an opportunity to tell a story in a very small space. And when it's done well, and Sam, who does Ristic Studies on YouTube, has a whole video on flavor text, which if people haven't watched, I encourage them to go and watch, because it's really well done. And it really kind of gets to the heart of the function that flavor text provides, where it's adding something to the card, it's bringing a little extra, it's situating it in a larger context, and in a way that doesn't have to matter for game purposes. And it's a really cool opportunity to just explore that world a little bit more. And it's something that I really enjoy doing, and it's just a lot of fun, and I certainly encourage other people, if they enjoy it, to do it too.
One of the things with flavor text sets in Magic is Magic Design has kind of acknowledged the role of flavor text to tell a story in Unstable. And this is where I get to brag about the piece of art that I own, Novellamental, which is a book that is flying, and it's a gorgeous piece of art. I'm getting it framed now. I'm so excited to see it.
Oh my god, I did not know that you had that.
Yeah,
that is amazing.
Yeah, so that's the first piece of like colored Magic art that I own. And there are 4 different versions of Novellamental, and the gag with the 4 different versions is everything about it is the same. The art, the name, the rules text. The flavor text is different. Over the span of 4 cards, it tells the story of a locket that gives its user wings. And it's really beautiful flavor text. And it's just a really cool card that's very close to my heart. And it literally tells a story in the flavor text that is kind of separate from the art even. So whereas like Reckless Pyromancer, or Dismissive Pyromancer rather, has a quote that could be happening in the card art, the Novellamental is a novella in the flavor text.
I also really appreciate that there's a pun on the card.
Yes.
The book's called Jane Eyre. Eyre's being in the air where the Novellamental is.
When I think about the role of flavor text in world building, you were talking about that a bit, Orc, as well. I always think about the kind of the OG world building flavor text set, which was Fallen Empires. And that's my favorite set in all of Magic.
Yeah.
The whole flavor text of that set tells this story of civilized empires on the continent of Sarpedia over the course of however many years, but get all of these different chunks of story. It's like you're reading out of a history book or out of a textbook, and they're all Sarpedian Empires Volume 1 through 6. And I mean, that was kind of groundbreaking for Magic to do then, because, like you said, Hobbs, they would use sometimes quotes from Einstein on card text. Shakespeare. I mean,
the Bible.
Yeah.
And Arabian Nights being a set that Richard Garfield designed, and I can't remember what it was, but he designed it by himself in a very short amount of time. Someone just went through and grabbed quotes from Arabian Nights. Like, that was the flavor text for every card of that set.
Yeah, the editor realized that the cards did not have flavor text, so she went through and did that in a night because it had to go out for printing the next day.
Well, and in addition to world building, a lot of it was a lot of it is character building too. And again, the example I'll go back to again, because she's one of my favorite characters, maybe my favorite character in the entire Magic universe, and is Jaya Ballard, who only existed in flavor text for the longest time. She didn't have a card. She didn't feature in the printed story materials until we got much later into the day. She was a character that only existed from the quotes on flavor text. And there was, when you think about kind of the strength of character and just the personality that you got from really just a very small amount of text. She's only quoted on 25 cards. It feels like it, in my head, I remember back and it feels like it must have been hundreds, but she's only quoted on a couple dozen cards. And a lot of these are, short quotes. It's just gotcha. And that was the only place where someone like Jaya Ballard existed. That was the only place where a lot of these characters existed. They didn't have cards. They weren't featured in art. They only existed in flavor, but it gave you that sense that there was this much larger world out there with these interesting people in it who you wanted to learn more about.
Which has allowed us to come back to those characters now. And I mean, I think there really has been a nod to the fans of the game kind of asking for this, basically, ending up getting a Fraley's card, ending up getting Jaya Ballard in a couple of iterations now, both Planeswalker and non-Planeswalker.
Just this week we got Lord Windgrace finally in
Yeah,
Commander.
I mean,
and Xantcha, who is probably one of the coolest, most interesting characters, just because so many horrible things happened to her.
Yeah,
in flavor text.
And it's interesting that the flavor text is like builds these little pieces. That's kind of I go to writing conventions and talk about the craft of writing, and that is a writing technique that short story and novel writers will use. You build the world with little details. You don't have to show everything. In fact, a lot of times you don't want to show everything.
And the thing I want to emphasize to people, which I think you can understand it at an academic level, but it becomes much more clear when you start trying to do an exercise like do flavor added, or if, which comes up in conversation whenever I'm fortunate enough to talk to the handful of people I know who, some of the incredibly talented people who actually work on names and flavor for the game. It's incredibly hard to do well. Flavor text is incredibly hard to do well. And it's incredibly, incredibly hard to do great because you have severe limitations in terms of space. You only have room for a very small amount of text in a lot of cases. We're talking a line, maybe 2 lines, and especially if it's something like a quote where there's going to be an attribution at the end, that's taking up another line. So you're working under extremely limited space constraints. You're working in a larger context, which also shapes and limits what you can do. It has to make sense with the art. It has to make sense with the function of the card. You don't want to do something which is thematically off-putting. You don't want to do something which takes away from the rest of what the card is doing or somehow creates confusion about what its function is. It's, again, to go to an analogy that Ristic Studies uses in his video about this. It's essentially like you're the rhythm section in a band or an orchestra. The job is to work with everything else, but not to step forward and steal the show, not to be the distraction. And it's an incredibly difficult balancing act for teams that work under incredibly tight constraints. And the fact that it's as successful as it is, as often as it is really a testament to the thoughtfulness that goes into this process.
One of my favorite examples of the space constraint being used in order to increase the flavor of the set is in Shadows Over Innistrad. Shadows Over Innistrad I really paid attention to because Innistrad was when I was first getting into buying a bunch of Magic cards and going to events with my friends. And so returning to Innistrad was great. And one of the ways that they conveyed the kind of mystery of Innistrad was these really short tidbits, these really short quotes from Tamio's journal about Avacyn. And you can find these on the clue cards. You can find these on Tamio's journal. But they're just these really small quotes that trail off that are kind of emphasize the mysteriousness and the detective kind of quality that Shadows Over Innistrad has. And that's and it also hints at Tamio being in Eldritch Moon. Tamio didn't show up in Shadows Over Innistrad, but she was there with the journal and the quotes from the journal, and we finally see her in Eldritch Moon.
And didn't we also have the Spanish card, or some of the foreign language cards actually had different entries from her journal on the Tamio's journal?
I don't remember that, but
I think there was numbers that were the numbers were different and stuff.
Oh, yeah, I think you're right. And that kind of led to that meta sort of discovery thing for all of us too when they were releasing cards.
That led to one of my favorite things in a Magic written story ever, and it was how her magic was represented, where she will literally, her spells are in the forms of stories. And it also shows where the new walkers, even though they don't have godlike power like the old walkers, because she was able to go to different planes, she had stories from different planes, and that was able to build her magic stronger, because she had a story from Mirrodin. She was talking about mirrors, and I can't remember all of them, but it was stories from different planes, and I just love that representation of magic.
Which interestingly is actually something of a rarity in the narrative in the game. We don't actually see a lot of characters in the game who their magic is depicted as coming from a scroll or a spell book. It's for all that features into the mechanics of the game, it's not something that we actually see that much in terms of some of the major characters in the storyline. It's rarer than you might think it would be.
That kind of moves us to our next point, sort of the meta lore part of it. We do have representation of Tamiyo using stories as magic. The other big representation of it is, this is going to be controversial here, but one of my favorite things in magic lore is Commodore Guff and the history of the multiverse. In the Invasion story cycle, he was one of the 9 titans that Urza brought together, the planeswalkers, to invade Phyrexia and destroy it. But Commodore Guff was he wasn't like a warrior or anything. He was kind of just this goofball dude who, his magic is based around the ability, he writes in essentially what is going to happen in the universe. He can kind of see what's going to happen in the multiverse, and he has this book that contains all of the things that are going to happen. And so people get hacked off about this, but he read through the end of the book and saw that Yawgmoth was going to destroy Dominaria, and the way that he helped, he was like, I can't ensure that Gerard or Urza's plan is going to work, but I can sure give them a chance. And he erases the last chapter of the book and changes fate in that way. I love that. And he's constantly like this joking character, and he's breaking the fourth wall and referencing the reader and like referencing things that were happening in Wizards at the time and Magic story at large. And I think that's super cool because we do have that sort of self-referential meta story character, in lore. He's kind of like Santa Claus meets Deadpool, I think. That's what I think of with Commodore Guff.
Oh my gosh, that's going to be the takeaway from this episode. I also like, now that I'm looking at Guff a little bit, that he lived in a hidden library.
Yeah,
that's awesome. I kind of want to do this. Yeah.
I feel like Tamiyo and Guff are the only two that have actually been ones that use text or literature as their medium.
That's our show. You can find the podcast at Goblin Lore Pod on Twitter. You can email us any questions, comments, or concerns at goblinlorepodcast@gmail.com. Morgan Wentworth can be found at MTGValkyrie on Twitter. The Orcish Librarian can be found at Bibliavore.org. Joe Redeman can be found at Findhorn, that's FYND Horn. Hobbs Q can be found at Hobbs Q. And Alex Newman can be found at Alexander New M. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you in part 2. And remember, goblins, like snowflakes, are only dangerous in numbers.